Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome you to our side event, CDM and NDCs, Way Forward from the CDM Executive Board. So with this side event, we want to focus on opportunities, barriers, and enabling measures for the CDM projects becoming a part of NDC implementation strategies. So after the adoption of the Paris Agreement represented a major breakthrough in the international climate negotiation process. It provides a blueprint for a new and ambitious and durable framework for international cooperation on climate change. The focus now is twofold: elaborating the rulebook of the Paris Agreement, and this is the reason why so many delegates and participants have come here to Bonn to work on this rulebook, and working on the ground towards the implementation of the nationally determined contribution which parties have taken under the Paris Agreement. And if you look to the time frame of the rulebook should be finalized as in 2018, which is not a lot time left for this elaboration and development. So the Clean Development Mechanism was originally set up as an offset mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And over the past decade, the mechanism has exceeded all expectations in terms of the sheer volume of activities generated. If you look to the numbers, you see almost 8,000 CDM projects, almost 300 large-scale programs of activities, and this in more than 125 countries. So the mechanism has reduced more than 1.7 billion tons of CO2 equivalents and attracted climate finance well over $300 billion US. So both the Paris Agreement with its nationally determined contribution and the Kyoto Protocol are under the same climate change convention, the UNFCCC. So both form part of the global landscape for climate change mitigation. Therefore, it is important to explore the relation of instruments elaborated under the Kyoto Protocol, like the CDM, to the Paris Agreement and its NDCs. How are projects under the CDM related to NDCs, and are there synergies? These are just some questions on it. We are now in an important phase of evolving climate action landscape. The CDM is still available. Instruments under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to enable cooperative actions are not yet operationalized, although there are parties that are willing to consider market mechanisms in the NDC and have stated to do so in the NDC already. So most NDCs are set to start in 2020, but parties and other stakeholders are already working towards these goals. And thus, we are in a transition period in this moment. The side event is intended to nurture the discussion, share some views and ideas on if and how projects under the CDM could continue to contribute to mitigation objectives under the Paris Agreement between now and also after 2020, given that continued and increased mitigation action is urgently needed to ensure that climate change stays well below 2 degrees Celsius. That's the target we have. And with this, I open this session from our CDM Executive Board, and I'd like to introduce you to the panelists which are sitting here with me in front of you, starting on my left side with Karen Holm-Olsen as a senior researcher in the Low Carbon Development Program at UNEP-DTU Partnership, Technical University of Denmark, and currently she is team lead for the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency and co-lead for the Sustainable Development component of the methodological framework. She was lead consultant to develop the CDM Sustainable Development Tool within the UNFCCC Secretariat that is approved by the Executive Board in November 2012. She has managed capacity building projects for the CDM, Green Growth, NAMAs, and NDCs in Africa, Asia, Middle East, holds a PhD in International Development Studies from Roskilde University, Denmark, a master degrees in political science, and a bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Copenhagen. So welcome you, Karen. Next in the row is Daniel Rossetto. He is Chief Executive of Climate Mundial, one of the premier private sector climate finance and sustainable development firms globally. Daniel pioneered on Paris climate bond concept development, and prior to founding Climate Mundial, Daniel was Executive Director for Environmental Markets at JP Morgan and served as a research supervisor for the University of South Australia in the period from 1999 to 2005, and also has been member of the Australian National Emissions Trading Task Force. Daniel holds an undergraduate degree from the University of South Australia and a postgraduate degree from the Murdoch University in Western Australia. He also holds qualifications in investment, so the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investments in the United Kingdom. So welcome you, Daniel. The next in row is Romeo Bartolini as panelist. He is working within the Climate Program's NDC Partnerships Support Unit, charged with the setup of Bonn office and the in-country and regional work of the partnership. He was working on the NDC partnership with World Research Institute from the very beginning. And in 2005, Romeo joined the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development here in Germany. From 2010 to 2014, he was heading the cooperation division at the German embassy in Windhoek, Namibia. After returning to Germany, Romeo joined the BMZ special unit of climate, being responsible for mitigation topics, climate investment funds, as well as the climate-related communications, press and civil society relations, and since Paris, the setup of the NDC partnership. So welcome you, Romeo. Next one in row, Stefan Hoch is a managing director of Perspective Climate Group, working on research and consulting related to UNFCCC negotiations and international climate policy, as well as carbon market and climate finance instruments. He is particularly interested in how successful CDM reforms, such as simplified methodologies, program of activities, and result-based climate finance can form the design of the Paris Agreement mechanisms. So welcome you, Stefan. Last but not least, we also have a moderator here, which is not me, but which is Dirk Forrester on the right side. He is formerly of NetSource and led IETA's CDM working group in its early years, so a lot of experience with the CDM, and later led the Market Oversight Working Group. And previously, he worked in the US government as chair of the White House Climate Change Task Force under President Clinton. And after being named as fellow, Dirk returned to IETA in 2012 as president and CEO. So welcome, Dirk, for moderating this. And then, of course, I've got here by my side Arthur Roll, the vice chair of the CDM Executive Board. He will also follow us here and give a wrap up at the end of the session of what we have heard and listened to this 1.5 minute we have in front of us now. So with this, we can go into the discussions and presentations, and I'm glad to hand over to Dirk. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank, and it is a pleasure to be here and have a chance to delve into a topic that I not only enjoy, but I believe is critically important to how we think about mobilizing climate action around the world. Business investors need frameworks to invest around. They need the regulatory clarity about how to move projects forward. There's a lot of private sector interest, I think, in being a part of the mechanisms of the future, but a lot of that enthusiasm comes from the experiences that they've had in the past. And I think one of the great achievements of the CDM has been broadening that experience all around the globe. And so now you can see examples all around the world of businesses that have had some experience with the CDM, who now understand how the concepts work, who understand what climate action is about, who understand what it takes to put together a project documentation book to take forward to a board for approval and to regulators locally for approvals and for taking it before the CDM Executive Board. They've had that experience and they can see the potential of doing even more with the markets of the future. Obviously, after the Paris Agreement, we're in a new dynamic. We're in a dynamic where we're elaborating a guidebook for how countries are going to account for emission transfers between each other and how they're going to hopefully launch a new mechanism that takes the best of the CDM experience and retools it for a future that could be quite vibrant. And I'm really humbled to be in the presence of so many negotiators here who have had a part in crafting those provisions and who are now going to be hard at work in helping to elaborate that rule book that we'll all need to operate within going forward. But I do think that if you talk to many business leaders around the world, they'll tell you that one of their core messages is you need a way of pricing carbon. You need a way of providing economic value in reducing and managing emissions, and an economic value that they can take to the bank and that they can raise investment in. And I think in the lead up to Paris, there was just a real profound call from business leaders all around the world about the importance of these kind of tools. And it's good to know that after Paris, the work is continuing, Frank, under your leadership and Arthur's leadership, in trying to look at how do we take the best of the CDM and adapt it for this new potential future that could be many times more important than what the CDM was to the Kyoto Protocol, because it has the potential of operating at a much grander scale in driving change. At least that's what our aspiration is at IETA, because we recognize that governments have set a very high goal of limiting temperature increases to 1.5 or 2 degrees. And in order for us to have a hope of doing that in an economically viable way, we're going to need these mechanisms to work in a way that really inspires businesses to come forward and participate in the global effort. This is a terrific set of experts that we have to start a discussion today, and we're going to try to reserve about 20 minutes of our time together for interaction with you in the audience. So I hope that we're able to stay on time for that, so that we can enjoy some dialogue with you and get your inputs on it. So the goal we know is clear of what we need to accomplish as a global community. We know that business has a big part to play in that. We know that this mechanism is all about unleashing that potential. So now we're going to talk to some experts about how we can go about doing that. So the focus of this is really about how the CDM can help with countries making their nationally determined contributions, how they can do that in a way that taps into the strengths of market dynamics and does so in an efficient way. I love this connection of the two important acronyms of CDM and NDC. So we're going to find out what that means to some experts and hopefully unpack it in a useful way for those of you who are here in attendance. So without further ado, Stephen, I think we're going to start with you. Are you prepared to go first? Okay. So Stephen Huck is here with Perspectives Climate Change. So Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for this very inspiring keynote and also for the introduction. Can you please bring up my slides? Someone? So I can already start talking about what I want to talk about, and that is the value of the CDM for mitigation action. And I was asked to do that in a nutshell. So I will not try to be complete or very detailed, but I have, next slide, please. I have, let's say, picked, can I control myself or shall I give instructions? Yeah, okay, good. Sorry? Okay, so I have sort of picked 3 issues that we believe are crucial regarding the value of the CDM and NDCs. And in case you're missing that, we explicitly did not focus on the financial dimension of the term value. We want to talk today about the CDM as an MIV toolkit, about the knowledge that CDM has generated. I also want to indicate to you what we believe is the mitigation potential of the CDM pipeline as it stands, as well as a conceptual evolution of the CDM, the programmatic approaches that could potentially help to scale up this mitigation potential even further. Next slide, please. So starting with this idea of the CDM as an MIV toolkit. The CDM obviously started in the early days of the Kyoto Protocol, where the idea that we need to do mitigation in all kinds of sectors and countries wasn't really that well developed. And people often forget that today, I think. So what I want to highlight is, you can see these two tables on the left-hand side of the slide from the UNFBTU CDM pipeline database. So the numbers in detail do not really matter too much, but the upper table here indicates that we now have almost 250 approved CDM methodologies. And what that means is that essentially we have almost 250 UNFCCC approved ways to measure mitigation impacts across all kinds of sectors. And that's an incredibly important source of knowledge that we can build on, whether we still call it CDM or something else. And I really want to highlight that. And what the table below shows is the number of times these methodologies have actually been used. And two things stand out. Obviously, there's a lot of methodologies that have hardly been used, but there's also a set of methodologies that have been used a lot. And from personal and practical experience, we know that some of these methodologies are still rather complex. I think it's fair to say that. But others have also really become much more applicable and simplified. So in other words, there is a toolkit on which can be built on, and that is a very important value. In particular, as we now have, moving on from Kyoto to the Paris world, as all countries have NDCs, where they have set goals for mitigation and where they are also expected in the future with rules that are to be defined, where they are expected to report on the achievement and the progress towards these goals. So we think here this MIV dimension is incredibly important. Second point, and next slide, please. The mitigation potential. What you see in the graph on the right-hand slide is taken from the UNEP GAP report, where we see on the upper level, the business as usual, then on the next level, the trajectory of current policies, then going down now in red and green respectively, the unconditional and conditional targets that the countries have put forward in their INDCs and NDCs. And below, unfortunately, we see this huge gap to what is needed according to the science. And the question is now, how can we close this gap? And then it's quite obvious that we have to ask the question in this context here, what could be the contribution of the CDM or even market mechanisms in a broader sense? And again, just a couple of numbers from the CDM pipeline. So if we aggregate the component project of CDM POAs and the single project, we have surpassed the 10,000 project or activity number. And that's really quite significant. We already heard about the investment value of these activities. And of course, these are theoretical numbers, but the pipeline as it stands would have a theoretical potential of close to 11 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2020 and almost 19 billion by 2030. So obviously, these are theoretical figures in a way that will not come to life as they are, because it's clear that this huge theoretical mitigation potential will partly be transitioned to these both conditional and unconditional pledges in the NDC that I already indicated, but also to domestic carbon pricing schemes, et cetera, et cetera. So not all of that mitigation potential will come to life through the CDM, but it is quite significant. Next slide. Last point, I wanted to highlight a conceptual evolution where we think the CDM has really added value, and that is program of activities. So just a brief visual overview of how POAs work. Essentially, POAs provide a framework in which an unlimited number of activities can be added to an approved program. This can be done with multiple technologies in multiple countries, and it's not by coincidence that I've just, as an illustration, chosen to list 2 African countries here, because POAs have really also made a difference in terms of providing access to the CDM in African countries. So with that, I'll come to my conclusions. Next slide, please. So market mechanisms clearly have a role in the Paris Agreement in Article 6, through Article 6. And the accompanying COP decision also very clearly instructs negotiators to take into account the existing experience with mechanisms to which the CDM belongs. So I've highlighted but 3 of these dimensions. There's certainly more to talk about, and I'm very curious to hear what other presenters will have to say. But it's clear that these are it's a multifaceted way of value that the CDM has to offer in the context of mitigation for the Paris Agreement goals. And what I think is very important and also very timely to talk about is how the transition from the Kyoto to the Paris mechanisms can be done in an orderly fashion that not only leverages the current mitigation potential, but also scales it up further, because that is what we need from the gap that I show. And I think one way that this could be done is to work more strongly towards synergies between mechanisms, not so much in silos, but to really try to combine the various strengths of these instruments in order to realize the mitigation potential. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Very helpful in helping to frame this discussion, and also I think end it with a really important point about, again, if we're thinking about scale and if we're thinking about efficiency, the thoughts about how the CDM and mechanisms of the future will work alongside the GCF, I think is a very important topic. And you know, I know of many projects along the way when I was working in project finance around these, and you'd run into difficulty of finding a financial institution that understood the investment analysis that you were bringing forward to them, and had the courage to go forward with it. And so having a GCF out there may be a valuable thing in the future. Daniel, so I brought up the investment community, and that's where you come from. So why don't we move to Daniel Rossetti next, and you, Daniel Rossetto, with Climate Mundial, and give us your views on sort of the CDM experience and what's important to think about for the future.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I think we're going to go to Romeo first. Is that okay? That way we're moving down the line. Apologies. So this, we'll go with Romeo Bertolini, who is with the NDC partnership from WRI.
Thank
Romeo.
you. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, we have heard a very interesting presentation already, and you have, Stephen, you made my day to some extent already, explaining this very important kind of issues around the CDM and how this could be linked to outside the climate-focused world. You called it a silo, and this is exactly what the NDC partnership is all about. We try to think, or we try to support after Paris the thinking that we have to go out of the silos and go a little bit more mainstream, in the sense that we need to consider, of course, planning ministries, development agendas, and the national development plans as one very important entry point for climate action. Now, I don't think I need to go into detail in the first couple of slides. I just have them there for completeness sake. You know, I don't know who is not aware of this, but of course we are heading towards even with the NDCs, we are not heading towards a 1.5 or 2 degrees world. We need to really raise ambition. I think you just can go to the next slide. We have this great commitment in Paris, and we have this enormous amount of good activities all centered around the agreement and the NDCs in most countries. And we base this on this framework that is very much centered around national efforts of various countries according to their capacity to mitigate, but also to adapt to climate change. So this is basically the very basic concept that we found after Paris. And next slide, please. But with a slight complication that we, of course, have to raise ambition significantly in order to get to the trajectory that leads us to the 1.52 degrees world. So this is one very core kind of idea of the NDC partnership, is to consider this trajectory as a indicative and imperative for joint work, for synergies, for leaving the silos and for leaving start thinking out of the box a little bit and try to connect the dots that are there in order to improve efficiency and climate action. Next slide, please. This was the launch. Remember, this is basically a startup we are talking about, which with a host organization, WRI, that has a deep track record, of course, in this area. But it's an independent kind of partnership that is that we launched in the end of last year under the guidance and the patronage of so many countries and multilateral organizations. We've been ever since continuing working on our governance structures, of course, but also on concrete activities. I'm going to tell you something about that in a minute. Next slide, please. The current status, and this is not even the latest one, is about 56 member countries. 40 of them are developing countries, all countries you can imagine, from Sao Tome to Brazil, from Fiji to Mexico. And the number is still growing. We just had recently joining Georgia, joining Mozambique, joining and Kenya in the last week. Next slide, please. And we have this, this very sound base of multilateral organizations that we work with and that actually implement also the work under the framework of the NDC partnership. I will elaborate on this a little bit more. So this is the basic setup of it right now. It's the institutional partners, the country partners, and other actors which we have, where we work on associated members from all kind of civil society organizations, private sector, and so forth. But as we develop, we are still working on a kind of a framework for that. But by all means, we have our institutional partners, the country partners that don't worry about it. Okay. Wow. I hope I wasn't too boring. There's some nice animation there. So this is the setup. Basically, what we have these partners with whom we work, and we have a support unit that is where I work, and where we have a couple of people running the process of three major pillars. Basically, can you go to the next slide, please? This is this is the three pillars we are working on. Basically, it's a high-level support, the political momentum which we want to use after Paris. So in order to not to become too technical, detailed, and so forth, we thought it's very, very important to keep that international and global momentum out of Paris, this dynamics. So this is the partnership. One idea is to really bring it up on that level. And one very core element is the integration of climate change into the development planning, the conceptual design, the national development plans, and of course the processes that lead finance ministers to their budget planning, both of course for core environmental issues, but also for sectors that are very relevant to climate change, like transport and so forth. Of course, at the very end of the day, there must be some idea of fiscal integration. There should be the climate action should actually be budgeted for and being integrated. And also the additional funding that comes, of course, from climate finance has to, from the long-term perspective, be integrated also in that area. Next slide, please. The partnership works on the basis of guiding principles, which we defined as very important. Some of them you may think are no-brainers, but when you look at the practical experience on the ground, things like proper alignment, coordination, the integration, international planning, the multi-stakeholder approach, and efficiency increasing efficiency and the long-term climate action promotion, considering adaptation is really crucial for a sustainable kind of integration of climate change into development. And so this is the principles our members basically sign off to, and we try to be as coherent as possible with these kind of guiding principles. Next slide, please. The in-country work, there's apart from a global, very comprehensive navigator toolbox and a knowledge portal that is being set up, we pretty much focus on in-country work, because the idea of the NDC partnership is to go to the countries and connect those dots between development cooperation issues and climate action. So the idea of this country model, which is very core to the partnership, is to start, of course, on request of a country, to go and have a comprehensive kind of overview of what's going on in terms of climate action, but also related to, of course, the sectors which are involved, and then try to improve and enhance the coordination mechanism and the joint approach from both government ministries that work together, but also between of course the government entities and the donor community, the private sector, and CSOs. So that at the very end of the day, you ideally in this coordination process, and that is driven by our partners, you end up in a more coherent kind of integration of the climate action, which is tailored to the needs of the country. Next slide, please. This is basically the steps we usually follow. There's planning, there's of course policy leverage, institutional arrangement, and finance and investment. Very straightforward. I don't think I have to explain that a little bit longer. Go to the next slide, please. And I think this is now the question which I asked myself in this context. What are the linkages now? And I think for me it was first of all more questions than answers. Where are the linkages between NDCs and the CDM? From the design of the partnership, the actual most pressing point would be to use this experience which you lined out for the further work of climate, or integrating climate activities into national systems. I think there's really a clear need for an effective climate instrument and carbon pricing instruments to implement NDCs, but we should also try to embed these instruments into national development planning. How do we also enforce this? This would be, I think, one question we could elaborate. How do we create this link between those, between the climate finance and carbon pricing link action and the budget, for instance? How does the interplay work between country-driven and global processes, particularly with respect to transparency and to the avoiding of double counting? I think that is a very crucial question, very much related also to Article 6. And what are the initiatives that enhance capacity of the parties to introduce and to go along the line of carbon pricing approaches to implement the NDCs? Do we already have some examples? Where could we go? What could we build upon? And what eventually could the NDC partnership do to create this link and to support parties in taking the carbon pricing into account in a more sustainable manner? I think with those questions, and I don't have the answers, I hope some others can elaborate them. I'm closing my little intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romeo. That was really helpful. Kind of in these two presentations, we have one that's looking at it, the question of how CDMs and national contributions work together. It's good to have one We have one on the CDM side to open with from Stephen, and then you give us a sense of all the things happening on the NDC implementation side. And it's really valuable to understand how those might relate. So thanks for bringing that together a bit with some questions there at the end. So Daniel, let's bring Daniel Rossetto up now from Climate Mundial, and he will talk a little bit about sort of a financial community perspective on this, on, sort of as an experienced player in this, what would be some of the things you'd be looking for in the new arrangements? Daniel.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, and thank you to the Executive Board for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to focus on the interaction of CDM and NDCs, but really looking at this from a private sector perspective. And in particular, I'll give you a small introduction to Climate Mundial, our company. But then I would like to go into, and perhaps I can have the next slide as well. Yeah, thanks. I'd like to look at the 4 different options that I see are available to parties in respect to the Paris Agreement, in terms of what they do, not just with the CDM, but perhaps with the Kyoto Protocol more generally. And in doing so, that will give rise to a number of technical questions, which I'll hope to answer as part of this presentation, although the technical issues may spill over into the discussion as well. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on the introduction because Frank gave some opening remarks before, but Climate Mundial is a climate finance and sustainable development firm. We're headquartered in London. We're focused specifically on mobilizing finance for investments in developing countries. We work a lot in Latin America, in Africa and Asia to that end. And we're also very strong supporters of convention mechanisms and aligning the work that we do to the various instruments of the convention, be that the Kyoto Protocol or eventually the Paris Agreement. If I could have the next slide, please. Onto this specific topic at hand, which is what are we going to do with the CDM and the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms in general when we introduce the rule book that has been discussed so far. And I spent a lot of time, I have to say, on thinking of these options, and I'm quite sure that someone will be able to come up with a 5th or a 6th. At one stage I even had 8, but I think they're more or less 4. It nails down to 4. And the first option is the full repeal of the Clean Development Mechanism and complete replacement with cooperative mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. Forgive me if that sounds a little bit like healthcare legislation in the United States, but I think we need to say it, that one option available to parties at the moment for the Kyoto Protocol is repeal and replace. Clearly the replacement has, to a certain degree, already happened, which is the Paris Agreement, but the rule book for the Paris Agreement has not been introduced, so we're not quite there yet. I don't think we're quite ready to properly talk about repeal at this stage, but it is an option. Option 2 is independent development of Article 6 or other mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, and the effective abandonment of the Kyoto Protocol. So that's basically no decision gets taken under the convention, and the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms and the CDM are allowed to just exist, but nobody uses them, and they eventually deteriorate and are more or less become redundant. The third option is actually that there is no decision as to what to do with the CDM, but actually it continues to operate, because as far as we can tell, we've done a lot of legal analysis on this. And unless there is a decision to repeal the CDM, yes, it's true that there may not be a 3rd commitment period, but the mechanism itself and the entitlement of projects to be able to monitor, report, verify, and have issuance of CERs will continue unless there's a decision taken by the parties to repeal the CDM. So 3rd option is that it operates in parallel with Article 6, and various countries in their NDCs recognize the CDM. Maybe not everyone, but certainly some. And the 4th, and I'll be lying if I said that this isn't the most common sense approach, as far as I can tell, is that there be a managed transition of the CDM. And I think if we're going to talk about Article 6, we might need to also raise the topic of joint implementation, because we are talking about countries with caps on emissions. And I think joint implementation is another mechanism that's sort of sitting there and people are not really deciding about it at the moment. But it's a managed transition, particularly of CDM, into the Article 6 framework. If I can just have the next slide, please. And I say this with respect to private sector interest. And this is something what is quite different about Article 6 with respect to Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM, is that we actually now have very specific wording talking about the private sector's involvement in the delivery of whether it be Article 6.4 or Article 6.8, which is the non-market mechanism. So I'm going to make the bold assumption and say that what the private sector thinks of this transition is quite important to the parties who wish to implement NDCs. And I think, Frank's already mentioned the numbers of 8,000 CDM projects, another 2,000 POAs and CPAs that are part of that. There's a lot of private sector investment that's gone into this mechanism. And it's very, very important that we think seriously about how those interests are going to be addressed. If I can have the next slide, please. So in doing that, I wanted to just raise a couple of interesting observations about what parties are already saying about this. And I noticed that we've got some good friends and colleagues from the Brazilian government here in the room, Mr. Andrade and Mr. Migues. But I think Brazil made a very interesting point in their submission, I think it was to the Marrakesh COP22, is that the ability of the climate change regime to ensure continuity and smooth transition between the CDM and the Sustainable Development Mechanism of Article 6.4 is key to the reputation of the Convention. Failure to guarantee to stakeholders, especially CDM project developers, that their efforts will be recognised and tangible in the context of the Paris Agreement will jeopardise legal certainty and prevent the contribution of CERs to fully contributing to early action and enhancing pre-2020 ambition, and the international community cannot afford this scenario. And I think this is very much worth reflecting on for a moment, because I think what the Brazilian government, if I can suggest, the Brazilian government is alerting parties to the dangers in respect of private sector activity of making ex post adjustments to regulatory frameworks going forward. And if we can move to the next slide. And making changes to ex post changes to regulatory frameworks is not a new issue. And what we have here is actually some text from the European Commission, going all the way back actually to 2005. So it's a little bit of a trip down memory lane to a degree. When dealing with the national allocation plans for phase 1 and phase 2 of the European emissions trading system, ex post adjustments, according to the European Commission, are incompatible with the legal framework and represent interventions that disrupt the market and create uncertainty for companies. For example, if a company faces the possibility that the government may take away allowances after it has reduced emissions, it will hesitate to do so. This is 2005, and this is the European Commission. So you may be wondering, what's all this got to do with the CDM? And in fact, it's very interesting. But just before we go on to that, just as a bit of a golden rule, when seeking to engage the private sector and its investment into any mechanism designed to induce a positive environmental externality, one should really avoid making ex post rule changes wherever possible. Wherever policymakers foresee that eventual changes may arise, be sure to declare those areas on an ex ante basis. So if you're a policymaker, give yourself enough room to make these decisions in the future, but declare it up front. The private sector reacts very strongly to those upfront signals. If we can move to the next slide, please. So the relevance of this to the CDM is actually crucial, because I hear a lot of people sort of say, well, look, there's a lot of CDM projects, they're already operational. Their marginal cost of operation is not contingent upon a CR price. We've got all sorts of difficulties getting our heads around how additionality has been assessed in the past. So we don't really, let's just forget about them and let's worry about new abatement now. That's what we're focused on. And we certainly don't want to recognise it after 2020. And I think that's when people properly understand what the CDM has been asking the private sector to do, that assumption needs to be revisited. And the first thing is that, and I've actually got an extract here from the CDM tool to help project proponents deal with investment analysis. And what you'll see is that the investment analysis, and this is one of the critical tools that projects are assessed for additionality, is they put in an economic model for financial additionality where they aren't dealing with barrier analysis or other means. And the CDM has specifically been asking people not to limit themselves to evaluating the economics of their project over the duration of the crediting period, but to go as long as the full financial life of the project, and to not be any less than 10 years. I don't understand why a project would want to evaluate their project on anything less than the full economic life anyway. But the implication of this, if you look at a renewable energy project, for example, 20 years, 25-year lifespans, they've been asked by the Executive Board of the CDM under the UNFCCC Convention to demonstrate the additionality of their project on the basis of a 20-year assessment. So let's take a project, for example, that was registered in 2010. That project is potentially taking into account the ability to generate an asset, which would be a CER, an entitlement. So it's very similar to what the European Commission was saying. Instead of getting a free allocation up front, which is what the European Commission was talking about, the CDM Executive Board is giving the project an entitlement to generate a ton of emission reductions, provided that it operates and builds a project in accordance with the project design document, and then measures and verifies those emission reductions over time. So any decision, going back to our 4 options, to potentially repeal the mechanism giving no transitional guidance for projects, or to just allow the mechanism to deteriorate, is going to directly impact. I'm not sure that there's any CDM project that's not going to be somehow influenced by that decision, because we're talking about the Paris Agreement coming in from 2020. So I would urge caution when thinking about this quite seriously. The other very important issue is that the people designing, or the parties putting into place the designs for Article 6 are going to, at some point in time, want to go to the private sector and want to motivate them to make investments in mitigation action, presumably over a 15 or 20-year lifespan, when potentially, having looked at the CDM, which is also a convention mechanism, the private sector will have seen the tendency of the international regulators to actually not take seriously that window for investment. So there's a lot at stake here. And it's for this reason that I put forward very strongly to everyone here today, and I hope that all the parties who are present will listen very seriously to this. We must look at the CDM in its context as being a convention mechanism. Private sector entities have been using the mechanism. The designated operational entities have been reviewing and validating these claims. The Executive Board has been opining on additionality for many, many years. We've got 8,000 projects. We've got almost 2 billion tonnes of CRs that have been issued. There is a lot at stake here. And it's very important, I think, that we take that into account. So going back to the topic of NDCs and the CDM, I think in the context of those 4 options, I think we need to be thinking very seriously about the potential impact of which of those 4 options we choose on the private sector, given that, as we've seen in things like Article 6.4 and Article 6.8, private sector engagement is a very serious and important priority. So On that note, and I'm just wondering how I'm doing for time. Okay, well, I had a number of technical questions, which I'm sure can be answered as part of the discussion. But I think that's probably a good point to wind up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. And we will try to make sure we get to some of the technical stuff in the Q&A. To round out our expert presentation, Karen Olsen is here with UNFCCC, the keepers of the database on this important topic, but also she brings a wealth of experience from the field as well. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the presentation, introduction, and maybe just on that word, I'll say that my colleague Jan Finhan is here, who's been managing the CDM pipeline for many years. Myself, I speak as senior researcher from UNFCCC Partnership. I also do have to thank the Gold Standard for me sitting here today. I am on their technical governance committee of the Gold Standard. So I'm speaking from that perspective, and we'll talk about the role of the voluntary climate action in the transition from pre-2020 to post-2020, and we call it a paradigm shift. It's the shift from Kyoto to the Paris regime. What does that mean for voluntary climate action? Yes, so that's the outline. What characterizes each of the regimes? What are the transition challenges? I'll talk about what we think a new paradigm can be for voluntary climate action, and the role that voluntary climate action can play to enhance ambition and promote sustainable development. Next slide. So first, as to the role of voluntary action. This shows the volumes in terms of millions of tons of CO2 that has been reduced due to voluntary actions, which looks like a lot here in absolute terms. It is a lot. It's compared to the compliance market, it's around 7%. So it's a lot, and then it's not a lot in relation to the compliance market. And the Gold Standard, I think, has had a share of that voluntary market around 20% or so. Next slide. Post 2020. Oops. Next slide. Good. Thanks. Okay. So. From what we're changing from the Kyoto regime to the new Paris regime, it comes in pieces. This slide. Yes, here's one piece describing the change. In the Kyoto regime, we had action or commitments by the Annex 1 countries, and in the Paris regime, we had actions by all countries, all parties. We have next. A focus on mitigation in the Kyoto regime. In the Paris regime, we have a broader focus on mitigation, also on adaptation and finance. And next, we have from Kyoto a focus on government action. And in the Paris regime, we have an enhanced focus on non-state actors. Some of the transition challenges for voluntary climate action in this regime change is that there's now a lack of a connection to commitments to reduce at home. Well, that has been, I think, a challenge also in the voluntary market, that many companies that buy voluntary credits would like to do more at home. And there has been a failure to gain a global endorsement of the offsetting idea. Also now in the Article 6, we see that there is a need to contribute to net emission reductions going beyond offsetting. However, with the new architecture in the Paris regime, with the NDCs, we don't have compliance markets anymore. It's all voluntary. I mean, from a party perspective, it's not the same anymore. And that has been, by some, also in the room today, Wuppertal Institute, described as the identity crisis of the voluntary market. Does this pull away the carpet, so to say? Does that undermine the business model completely for voluntary climate action because of the risk of double counting? Who knows now, when you reduce a ton of CO2, if that ton of CO2 is in the NDC or not? You can't sell that as an offset if it's part of the NDC of a country. So who wants to buy a credit from the voluntary market if it doesn't offset anymore? How do we figure that out? Those are some of the transition challenges. Oops. The next slide. So the new paradigm. From Kyoto, companies had emission reduction targets based on their internal assessments. In the new paradigm, companies, and this is a proposal, coming from, very much coming from the gold standard thinking. And there's also an opinion piece that describes these ideas on paper. But the idea is that companies would set their emission reduction targets based on science, what science says is necessary to achieve the 2-degree target. In the Kyoto regime, private sector contributions helped close the emission gap with offsets. In the new paradigm, private sector contributes to closing the emission gap. But not only that, it can also contribute to the finance and the adaptation gap. In the Kyoto regime, offsetting was a carbon reduction mechanism. In the new regime, it's also a climate finance mechanism. And the idea is to go from carbon credits, as we know them, the CRs, to something else, which is more labeling the emission reductions, certified statements of emission reductions. And I'll go into a little more detail on what that means in the next slide. Oops. It's too small on my paper. I need to turn around. So the carbon credits we know, because you know them from the Kyoto regime. What's new is the statements of emission reductions. Yes, they should be additional. They can be within the host country target, part of contributing to the NDC. Could be a company in France contributing to the emission reduction target of France based on such a certified emission reduction statement. That means that the certified statement would be within the host country inventory. But it changes the claims, the nature of the claims that companies can make in this regime. You cannot use it for carbon neutrality if it's also counted against a party's NDC. You can say that you have supported someone to achieve their NDC, but not that you have done net contributions to the atmosphere. So you can make a claim that you have contributed to finance emission reductions. Yeah, next slide. Those are some of the challenges. I will also speak to some new opportunities that I think are very prominent in the Paris Agreement. As you probably know, the Paris Agreement was not the only very important global agreement we had in 2015. We also had the 2030 agenda for the Global Sustainable Development Goals. And if you read the Kyoto Protocol and compare it to the Paris Agreement, you will find that sustainable development is mentioned. I think it's actually, does it say 3 times? I think it's actually 6 times. Yeah, it says 3 up here, but I think it's 6 times. 6 times in the Paris Agreement. Sorry, in the Kyoto Protocol. 22 times in the Paris Agreement. So there's a completely new framing of climate actions in context of sustainable development. And as we heard that from the NDC presentation, that climate mitigation is about climate change. It also offers opportunities to promote sustainable development in context of countries' sustainable development priorities. It's very prominent in the new Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that in the 6.1 article, that it's a principle that all mechanisms shall contribute to sustainable development, just like all mechanisms shall contribute to environmental integrity. It's very similar to the CDM, but it's more prominent in the Article 6. I can go into more details, but I will not. Let's take the next slide. This is the message. Why is sustainable development important? Well, it is that in itself. It is also important from a market perspective. And this slide is based on a study commissioned by the Gold Standard, which compares the value of sustainable development benefits and monetary values to the monetary value benefit of a ton of CO2. So if you take the example of biogas, 1 ton of CO2 has the market value of $5 to $20 per ton, but the sustainable development benefits, primarily the health benefits, the blue bar, amounts to an evaluation of the co-benefits to the value of $41 per ton reduced for biogas projects. And you can see the examples for other types of mitigation activities. So the idea is that potentially there's also a market for these sustainable development co-benefits, and that can leverage the mitigation actions. We need tools and metrics to measure this, but in the CDM, it was not factored in to the CR price, or it could be if you use voluntary standards or other ways, the CDM SD tool or other ways to make it explicit. But there was a tendency to leave it out, forget about it to some extent, which there's an opportunity now to change that. And last slide. So what is the outlook for this transition from pre-2020 to post-2020? Well, we have the CDM, a lot of infrastructure, institutionally, in companies. And regarding sustainable development, we have a voluntary sustainable development tool. We also have the 2030 agenda on defining 17 goals for sustainable development. So that there is an opportunity that this can help leverage the mitigation actions through better ways of getting to know the sustainable development benefits, which can help, again, raise ambition and contributing with finance. We can learn from the CDM SD tool to set robust standards from CDM to Article 6. CDM experience can be linked and harmonized with the new Article 6 mechanisms. And if we have that, we don't know yet that is being negotiated, what the rule book should look like also for the SD provisions. But it could have the potential to, and I believe it does have the potential to enhance the national priorities for sustainable development, to have harmonized SD assessment, not only for 6.4, but across the 3 mechanisms. It's a cross-cutting issue. But particularly for the Article 6.4, which some call the CDM Plus, there's a scope for learning lessons from CDM into the new Article 6. I'll finish here. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for a really provocative presentation about really illustrating all the values that come from carbon mitigation projects and different ways of thinking about use of these mechanisms and the different values they can drive going forward, and really also the importance that voluntary markets could play into the future. They have been, I know, in many respects in recent years, after the changes in policy in the EU, really a lot of the market activity shifted over to voluntary markets in Europe and other places, and that's where a lot of the experience is being gained now. So it's turned into a pretty important segment of the carbon market universe. So we've had 4 presentations. We've learned a bit about some of the potential of the existing pipeline of CDM projects that Stephen walked us through, and some of the ways that it could potentially flow into the new mechanism. We also learned a bit more about a lot of the great things that are happening in implementation of NDCs and the support available for that, and the ways that, again, project implementation through a CDM mechanism and the MRV that comes along with that might play into national programs. We heard a private sector view from Daniel about the interest of the private sector in stability and in continuity between the old and the new. And then finally, Karen's presentation that I already summarized. So very useful set of presentations. I'd like to now turn to the floor for questions and comments from you in the audience. And all I would ask is that I think we've got some microphones. I know there's some microphones that you can throw at each other in this room. So we've got our first question here. Oh, Jürgen at the front. But I think because of people online, we need to use the microphones. And then I've got 2 more questions back here. But if you'll identify yourself for those that are not in the room. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Jørgen Fenhan, and I think, as usual, the devil is in the detail. Therefore, I would really like if we could have the last part of your presentation, Daniel.
That, of course, is beyond the skills of the moderator, but with some, maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions here and back here, and then we'll move across the aisle. So we'll take 3 questions, and then we'll come back for another round.
Yes, Axel Michaelova from Perspectives at the University of Zurich. My question to the panel would be, how do you see the chance of engaging international climate finance institutions to really take up what the CDM has achieved and synergize, and not to, again, build iron curtains? The GCF recent decision to ask a developer to cancel CRs in order to get a GCF loan, in my view, was a dangerous precedent, and I would like to see your views how this could be avoided in the future.
Thank you, Axel. And then we'll take one more right across here. Yeah, well, there we go. Magic.
Thank you, moderator. I'm Faustin Munyazikwiye, Director of Climate Change Department in Rwanda. I have one quick question to Dr. Romeo on NDC partnership. Thank you for informative presentation. I would like to know what is the conditions of joining the NDC partnership for parties or for countries who wish to join. Secondly, I would like to know what's the process of requesting the technical support through the NDC partnership. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. So while we're looking, scrambling for Daniel's, we're going to give you a go. It'll be brief, but on the technical questions at the end. But before we go there, maybe we'll take the other questions first. Who would like to pick up the finance question? we touched on it just briefly, but about ways that the sort of the CDM experience could actually enhance the ability of, if I'm paraphrasing you, Axel, but could enhance the ability of getting good things started more with public funds, the public fund side. So Daniel, you want to start with that?
This is a very good question, Axel, and it does actually trip over some of these technical issues, which will come up in a minute. But I would have thought that the GCF asking a developer to make sure their project was registered with the CDM and that the concessional benefit they get is not a revenue increase through the sale of CRs, but it's actually a concessional loan that reduces the cost of capital. And let's say the reduction in cost of capital might be a couple of %, in which case it might be a conferred CO2 benefit of in the order of 7 to 12 euros, let's say. I would have thought it was, and the source of that that financial benefit is climate finance as opposed to a mitigation commitment coming from elsewhere. I would have thought that's exactly what we want the GCF to be doing. And even more, I think what we also want the GCF to do in the long run is to use the CDM as a means of enforcing the mitigation commitments that project developers putting forward a proposal to the GCF. You're saying we're going to achieve 1 million tonnes per year of emission reductions. There ought to be a base level of mitigation that one commits to, and where it's enforced. So if we think about results-based finance, we're talking about reverse engineering that. You're giving them upfront the reduction in cost of capital, but you're asking the projects or the programs to deliver, and you're actually going to enforce that. So I would have thought, first of all, that that's absolutely what you want. And what you particularly don't want is that the GCF develops its own system for determining additionality, for undertaking measurement and verification, and then therefore we might end up with tonnes under the GCF which are different to the tonnes that we have under the CDM or other mechanisms of the convention. I think that's a particularly negative situation for us to be in the future, and one we ought to avoid at all costs. Therefore, I think it's a good move by the GCF.
And Stephen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. Just very quickly, Daniel, just picking up on your last point, I really do think that the existence of NDCs really makes it almost does not provide any alternative for having a harmonized MIV framework. Because what the GCF currently does is to delegate the responsibility for developing the MIV framework for the accredited entities. And that basically means you will have very different systems, potentially, for the same project type, which means you end up with apples and oranges. And I don't think that's what you want to have when you report to, when you aggregate then all the actions in your country and report on the progress to your NDC. And that's exactly what I meant in my presentation with what's the value of the CDM as an MIV tool. And then just last point quickly. So while that example that you cite, Axel, is of course a bit alarming, then maybe a bit more positively, at least to my knowledge, there is no clear rule that would prevent the CDM from being used in the context of the GCF. And in fact, what I found rather encouraging was the outcomes of a recent consultation of the GCF in the context of RED+, where the use of emission reduction certificate, or in this case, not emission reductions, but certainly certificates that are denominated in CO2, has been very positively discussed. And maybe a spillover of that discussion could also touch on the CDM. And now my last point on that is a procedural one, because what we saw in terms of the GCF's evolution, the GCF is very actively engaging in a dialogue with other UNFCCC institutions, such as, for instance, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, and a couple of others. And in my view, virtually the only relevant one that is not as in that list is the CDM. And I haven't found someone yet who could explain that to me. But certainly, given that both are within the context of the convention, I think it would make a lot of sense to have this conversation between the GCF and the CDM on all of the different dimensions that we are talking about today. And I think the NDCs really require that type of conversation.
Thanks, Stephen. And Frank, you can take a note on that for you and Arthur. That's an assignment you just got. Romeo, Africa Carbon Forum had a wonderful experience in Rwanda a couple of years ago, or is that just last year? Anyway, what does Rwanda need to do to gain access to the assistance on NDC implementation?
Yeah, it's a very straightforward process, actually, very easy. It's free, and you just send a letter to our co-chairs announcing the counterparts in your country. The request would be, or the one of the core ideas of the NDC partnership is, as I said so many times, to combine the world of the planning and the finance ministers with those of the environmental ministers that are in charge of climate. So usually, what we usually do is we have two counterparts, one from the finance side and the one from the environmental side. So that's basically all. If you like me to go into more detail, just give me your card and I can send you also a link to that. The general idea of this is really, and I think it also relates to the discussion we're having here. I'm always getting very, or I always got very confused also when I was in the embassy in Namibia about this global huge amount of global activities, be it the NAPs, the NAMAs, the CDMs, you name it. It really confused to some extent my counterparts in the countries and myself, to be very honest. So the idea is to bring this little bit more to a concrete level and link it to the inside of each country. And I think whenever you have an example or a CDM kind of activity, and you can link that to the national level and explain what it actually can do, very, very, very simple, basically, without big fuss around measurement and stuff like that. I think it makes clear what the value is, and I think that is one thing which we can try at the partnership with this leverage we're having also to and this access we have to these people outside the climate community, to show where you can make a difference with what kind of activity on the ground. We have it identified on a couple of trips we've already done, and exchanges we have identified so many very concrete activities and saw so much more climate action than, for instance, it was stated in the NDC. There are countries that have a very weak NDC, very, not weak, but more or less a very simple one. But if you look at the development plans, if you look at the sector plans, it's highly sophisticated when it comes to climate action, even underlined and with budget and financial means. So this disconnect of this political climate change kind of world with the real world is quite astonishing, and I think that is one thing we want to bring together a little bit.
Maybe we should take stock of that next year. Daniel, I've got your slides teed up now, and I'd like to get in one more round. So if I give you a budget of like 2 minutes to go through, I think it's 3 slides or 4 slides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, but I just wanted to, a couple of the key points, the key technical ones. The first one is we hear a lot of people saying, well, now that we have unconditional commitments in INDCs of developing countries, that automatically influences the baseline. As far as I can tell, the unconditional commitments are predicated, they're not conditional upon, but they are predicated on the availability of $100 billion per annum by 2020 of climate finance, the availability thereof, and it's additional money. So not official development assistance that's been channeled into a different area. So the first thing that we must do really before we try and say that these unconditional commitments are the new baseline, as it were, is to say how seriously have we advanced towards knowing exactly where that 100 billion a year is coming from before we start having that baseline related discussion. The second point, people are referring to baselines which are based on business as usual projections. So I lost count of the number of countries who've said they're going to reduce their emissions by X% on business as usual unconditionally and come down even further if there's some access to market mechanisms. Having said that, who's going to set what is business as usual in that country? So it's almost as if some people are implying that all the developing countries are going to cap their emissions at an absolute level with no allowance for growth. So the second point is, before we get locked into that discussion about the baselines having to be less because of the unconditionality of some of the commitments, I think we need to think about how we're actually going to establish what is business as usual. It's absolutely crucial. The third point, even where you've got a country that's taken an absolute cap in a developing country, I mentioned before about the EU ETS. I'd like everyone to reflect back to phase 2 of the European emissions trading system, where you had member states hosting project activity under Article 6 of the Kyoto Protocol, which is joint implementation, in sectors that were covered by the cap. And what they did under the national allocation plans in the European ETS was create joint implementation reserves. So you could get started with your JI project well before 2008, knowing full well that there was going to be a reserve that would allow for ERU credits to be issued, even if the projects were happening in sectors that were capped under the EU ETS. So there's so many other options that are available to us, rather than taking this reasonably blunt view that you have to have a lower baseline immediately because of unconditionality. And the last point, the last technical point, which I wanted to raise, is the Paris Agreement is very strong on promoting early action. I would like to ask, and I'm really calling for serious answers, what mechanism under the convention is available to you today to accredit your project as being additional to business as usual and to get certification on your mitigation outcomes, other than the CDM? Now, if what people are suggesting is that we wait until Article 6 is ready, I think we have to really question what what the intent is of the early action requirement under Paris. So I would say, if we're serious about early action, we don't actually have a choice. We've got to get on with it, and we've got to follow exactly what Brazil has suggested in their submission to COP22. So some of the questions, there's obviously more, but hopefully that's satisfactory.
Great, thank you, Daniel. But I believe we are out of time. Apologies that I can't allow another round of questions, because I would love to. Mbai is throwing a flag at the front. I think I might have to take one question then. I might have to take this one on the front row. And then Arthur, you've got your summary ready to go, I know. And so Mbai, please.
Thank you, and thank you for your different presentations. I just have a very quick questions. Thank you, and thank you for your presentations. I just have two quick questions, one to Romeo and another one to Karen. The first one to Romeo: does the NDC partnership already support countries to identify how they will deal in their conditional and non-conditional NDC when they involve projects, CDM projects, and programs, POAs, generating CRs after 2020? Because in many NDCs, when identifying the emission reduction potential, many developing countries, whether it is conditional or non-conditional, haven't worked deeply on the ownership of the emission reduction, the usage envisaged by the order of the different one, They just have identified the potential of reduction and put them whether unconditional or conditional one. And it's very urgent to when updating those NDC or working on the implementation of the NDC, because they will have to report on that. They have to clearly identify those different things. And I think it's an urgent work to be done. Have you already started to look at that for the developing countries? Another one is related to the sustainable development criteria. You have known in all the Article 6, you are always talking about sustainable development, and in your presentation, you have provided very interesting finding in relation to the health, because I see that is the main gain in the figure you have proposed, but it's difficult to assess. And how do you think those sustainable development criteria can be integrated in the guidance or modality and rules to have very precise assessment? Because we are talking about the rules, modality, and procedure when it comes to markets. We don't have to have very subjective assessment or something like that. Have you already worked on that, or you plan? Do you plan to work on that to support the implementation of Article 6? Thank you.
Thank you, Mbai. So let's start with Romeo. How is the NDC partnership dealing with this?
Well, thank you. I think you just uncovered a little bit of a weakness in my presentation, being not able, or I didn't have the time to work out a little bit more in detail what we actually do in the ground. There are about 10 to 15 countries that we engage with right now. There are more to come, but the capacity has to be built up. The idea is to use the NDC, review the NDC, and look at the action on the ground, bring these activities together, and to see to develop out of that a kind of an operational plan, an action plan for the implementation of the NDC. This may be based on the NDC itself, but it could also be based on the national development planning of a country XYZ, or the sectoral planning. That is not really the issue. It's just the ownership and the basis should be in the country. Whenever we start to engage in that and start a kind of a mapping exercise where what is going on there and what kind of activities we build on, of course, the idea of a NAMA, of a CDM regulation or activity would certainly be taken into account. But remember, this is not the NDC partnership exclusively does it. We build upon our partners also on the ground, bringing them together, the World Bank, the UNDP, the GEF, all these kind of things. So and the UNFCCC we have there as well. So there is a quite a coverage when we go to the country of this, and we ask our members basically to report on this. But of course, I mean, I don't want to be too enthusiastic at the moment. We need to work these details out. We need to reach out a little bit more also to the countries and do some heavy lifting there as well in the country.
Thank you, Romeo. And Karen, a quick response then on the sustainable development aspects of Article 6.
Yes, the quick reply. Have we worked on precise sustainable development assessment? Yes, it exists. The barrier is not technical. I can give you the examples. There is the gold standard for the global goals is doing measurement, very precise quantified impact assessments for sustainable development, not for all types of benefits, but for some. One of them is health. The UNDP Sustainable Development Goal tool is one tool that exists. The Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, supporting and implementation of Article 13 in the Paris Agreement. Yes, we're developing the guidance. The barrier is not technical. The barrier is political. And someone in this panel, Perspectives, has done a big report on all the barriers. And that's pretty complex. This is really, we could talk a long time about the politics, the barriers. That's very difficult, but not the technical part.
That's being dealt with in another room. Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce Arthur Roll to give us, he's the Vice Chair of the CDM Executive Board, and he's going to give us his take on this discussion. Arthur.
Thank you, Dick. Good afternoon, everyone. We've had some very interesting presentations, and the discussions today leave us with some very good key points that I would like to share with you. The first being the CDM has some tremendous value for mitigation action. And we saw this in light of MRV's mitigation potential and program of activities. We have seen how the core elements of NDC partnership can be of value. In parallel, work with the NDC's implementation that is starting. We also widely recognize that the CDM has value and can still contribute significantly to the Paris Agreement implementation. The question is, how can this be achieved? It is recognizable that market mechanisms have a clear role for NDC achievement through the Paris Agreement, Article 6, and related country initiatives. The second point is that the CDM is for many countries still the only instrument under the UNFCCC which is available and has dealt with the many aspects of mitigation action over a decade. The CDM has answered all of the questions which any mitigation instrument would have to face, from establishing baselines, demonstrating additionality, offering a strong MRV, and being open, transparent, and adjustable. Of course, instruments are expected to emerge as part of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, yet we do not know when, but are knowledgeable. We have been shown the challenges that we will face in the future. That is changing from non-compliance, from compliance to voluntary. There are many, well, we've been given at least 4 different scenarios for the future of the CDM. And it boils down to the fact that it is on parties to decide what to do with the CDM, not only as an instrument, but also with regard to the whole value chain it has created in terms of infrastructure, units for mitigation achieved, and even simply mitigation delivered by CDM projects, which will in many cases continue no matter what after 2020. Interaction between the CDM and NDCs in one form or another are unavoidable. 2 key questions that has been discussed here today are, 1, how do we link the CDM and NDCs? And 2, should these interactions be managed by some decision? The best scenario is, of course, if synergies are captured and a seamless transition from a pre-2020 to a post-2020 climate action landscape is enabled with no gaps in instruments and continued incentives for climate change mitigation. This is best achieved if a continued recognition for the mitigation value of the CDM is ensured. Interfaces between the CDM and NDCs are desirable, and the CDM could play a great role, for example, for mobilizing and recognizing early action and even lay the foundation for action after 2020. So in summary, I believe that above all, there's a need for certainty, a signal from all CDM stakeholders and all carbon market actors about if and how CDM will be transformed into a new role where long-term climate action under the Paris Agreement is also supported. On behalf of the CDM Executive Board, many thanks to our speakers, Karen, Stefan, Romeo, and Daniel, our moderator, Dirk, and Chair, Frank, and all of you in the audience for making this a very interesting and useful side event. We look forward to more in the future. Thank you very much.
I don't know how many minutes, but it's close to